Greetings, students. Mr. Sanger here to talk to you about viruses and the cell theory. So, have you ever been in school and thought to yourself, why do I need to learn this? Believe it or not, I, as a biology teacher of the past 15, 20 years, I've actually heard that phrase quite a bit. And even with something as fascinating as viruses, I've heard students say, why do I need to learn about this? Why do I care about viruses? How are viruses ever going to affect my daily life? So say what you will about the year 2020, but it's certainly given me the I told you so of the millennium for any past student who ever asked me why we need to learn about this. So viruses, first of all, they're fascinating, but second of all, think about this tiny little virus, this little tiny thing that you don't even know what it is yet, has brought our entire humanity, basically the entire globe, to its knees. It's shut down our economy. It's caused all this trouble. And so obviously, it should be something of interest to all of us to understand what is a virus and how does it manage to cause so much trouble for us. So that's what we're going to get into with this unit. Our specific objective for today is to use the cell theory to explain why viruses are considered non-living, really? Non-living? And why viruses rely on living host cells. So this non-living piece, wait, viruses are non-living? That should seem a little odd to you because we know that viruses can spread quickly. We know that, well, I guess we don't know. We think we want to try and stop it, kill it. So can we kill it? Is it possible to kill a virus? And then we hear about mutations. So what does it mean that the influenza virus mutates easily? So is it alive? Is it not? Well, let's remind ourselves, what does it mean to be alive? So one of the characteristics of being alive is to consist of at least one cell. And you and I, of course, are multicellular organisms and have many cells. And so what is a cell? What does that mean? What do we know about cells? Well, remember, the cell theory says that all living things are made of one or more cells. Two, cells are the basic unit of structure and function in organisms. In other words, if we want to understand how the human body works, we need to understand how those basic cells in the human body do their jobs. And three, all cells come from existing cells. And we learned about this through mitosis and meiosis, how cells can give rise to other cells. So let's kind of take that and then filter this topic of viruses through the lens of the cell theory. So the table in your packet, you might want to fill that in while we go through this. So viruses are not made up of cells. So they don't have all those cell structures that you learned about earlier in the year. That's interesting. So they don't have a nucleus. They don't have, well, we'll see what else they don't have. They don't obtain or metabolize energy. So there's no metabolism. And so they don't have mitochondria. They do not grow in size, and they do not develop over a lifetime from a juvenile virus to a mature virus. So there's no such thing as a baby virus or an adult virus. They just are. They're just a virus. So they don't grow, they don't develop. They can't regulate internal conditions or respond to stimuli. So, if you go outside on a cold winter day, you're going to start to shiver. If you go outside on a really hot day, you're going to start to sweat. So you can regulate the internal conditions of your body. Viruses don't do that. They just are. They can't respond to stimuli. So if someone threw a ball at me, I could, dodge it. A virus would just, get hit in the head. They can't respond to stimuli in any way. They also can't reproduce without a host cell. They need a living cell in order to reproduce. And that's because they don't have their own ribosomes. So they don't have a nucleus, they don't have mitochondria, they don't have ribosomes, they don't have cytoplasm, they don't have all of that basic cellular machinery that we learned about. So they are not considered to be made up of cells. Because of all this, they are considered to be non-living. So then you're like, well, wait a minute. If biology is the study of life, why are we studying viruses, which are non-living? And the answer is because viruses, as we have seen this past year, have a huge impact on living things. They are active in our cells, and they infect our cells, and they basically take advantage of our cells for their own evil purposes. And here's just kind of a listing of some viruses, many of which you've heard of: HIV, hepatitis B, the Ebola virus. There was an outbreak in Africa not too long ago. The flu, Adenovirus is the common cold, and then a bacteriophage, which you probably haven't heard of. Those infect bacteria. So you've definitely heard of lots of these viruses. So we've talked about what viruses don't have. What do they have? Well, the most important part of a virus is its genetic material, and they do have genetic material. Some of the genetic material is DNA, and so here are some viruses with DNA as their genetic material. Other viruses have RNA as their genetic material, and here's some examples of RNA viruses. The viruses use this genetic material as instructions to make more viruses. They also have proteins, and those proteins help that virus attach to its host cell and do some other things, as we're going to see. But again, no cell structures. So some viruses contain RNA, some contain DNA, and then both RNA and DNA genetic instructions are used to make proteins to build new viruses. And again, the viruses don't have their own machinery or ribosomes to make viruses on their own, so they basically are going to inject their own genetic material into a host cell, and then that host cell's machinery will use that genetic material to build new viruses. So, so they can't reproduce without a host cell. They have to hijack a host cell. And you can see here's a bacteriophage virus attacking a bacterial cell. So it attaches, it's going to inject its genetic material here. Here's another virus, influenza, where it's going to kind of insert genetic material into that larger cell. So again, viruses need a living host cell for reproduction. And what they do is that genetic information essentially kills off the host cell. Actually, no. Yeah, it does. Sorry. Okay. So we kill off the host cell, and then we use the host cell's machinery to produce more viruses. And so then, the virus can't live or die. It just does its thing. And so when the host cell dies, that virus is released and can spread to other cells. And again, the key is that the virus is using the enzymes and ribosomes of the host cell to do its thing. So the host cell's machinery reads and copies the viral instructions, that genetic material, and uses it to make more viruses. So here's a video that I would encourage you to watch that looks at how the flu virus actually enters a host cell. And again, to summarize, basically it inserts its genetic material. The host cell uses its own enzymes and ribosomes to transcribe and translate that genetic material into proteins. And then those proteins are used to build new viruses and kill the host cell. So it's quite diabolical how these viruses kind of use our own machinery against us to help spread themselves. Now, obviously, we should talk about COVID-19. That's the new coronavirus. You can see it has RNA as its genetic material instead of DNA. And you may wonder, well, is that a good thing, bad thing? Does that help the virus? Does it make it easier to deal with, harder to deal with? Well, it turns out it makes the virus harder to deal with, and that's because RNA viruses mutate faster than DNA viruses can. And the more mutations that happen, the more the virus changes, and the harder it is for us to deal with it. So viruses, in other words, evolve as these mutations change and then help them infect new host cells or infect host cells more effectively or help themselves spread more effectively. So when a host cell is hijacked, they mass produce copies of the virus, and that mass production results in mutations because anytime you copy genetic material, mistakes are going to be made. And those mistakes in copying the genetic material are called mutations. It turns out that RNA viruses are in fact more likely to mutate than DNA viruses are. And the reason why is that when your DNA is copied, there's this proofreading mechanism that kind of kicks in. The cellular machinery actually checks to make sure that the DNA is being copied properly. RNA viruses, they don't have that proofreading mechanism. And so as a result, when RNA is copied, there's no proofreading, which means more mistakes happen, which means more mutations occur. And those mutations let the virus be unrecognizable by the host cell's immune system, potentially, which then becomes problematic. And so with the coronavirus, you may have heard of new variants, and the variants may be better at spreading or maybe causing stronger symptoms. And that's because of these mutations that have accumulated as this virus has been spread and has mutated as it sort of worked its way through the human population. Some mutations even allow for viruses to jump from host species to a different host species. Here's a good video that explains this, but again, we actually think that the coronavirus began in an animal and that it was close contact between humans and animals that allowed that a particular mutant of that virus to sort of jump into humans. And then once it was in humans and knew how to attack our cells, it was able to spread throughout. So a virus that normally infects pigs can jump and begin infecting humans, for example, as this video will show. So that's kind of a little overview of viruses. And again, the whole point of this is to remember that viruses are considered non-living because they lack that cellular machinery. And as a result, they need to inject their genetic material into a host cell and then use that host cell to copy themselves and spread. So that's all we got for now. Thanks, team.